Welcome, everyone, to the OnPoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, it looks like Premier Doug Ford won't have to pour any more Crown Royal down the drain. He's made peace with that brand's manufacturer.
After critics complained about more than 7 years of starving the postsecondary system, the province is giving colleges and universities a lifeline, but making significant changes to OSAP.
Not the case for school boards, however. Rumors persist that the education minister is going to get rid of them. And none of his recent actions is disabusing anyone of that notion.
And in your column, my column, I will make the case for reprohibiting online gambling.
Reprohibiting. Okay, that's a neat word. And I'm focusing on something I still think is important and not some old-fashioned notion, and that is civility in public life.
It's Friday, February 20th, 2026, so let's get to it.
JMM,
Steve.
Good to see you, pal. Little sugar to start things off, as always.
Good to see you.
Now I see you're in mourning. And, it's for those who are listening on podcast and can't see this,
Yes.
You are wearing a shirt
Yes.
which says, Pluto, never forget, 1930, which I presume was the year the planet was discovered,
Yes.
to 2006, which I presume is the year that it was determined it is no longer a planet.
Yes, the year that astronomers sinned against us all and demoted Pluto from the ranks of the 9 planets. I periodically in this podcast take a little bit of fun. I hope I'm never cruel or unkind about it by emphasizing the age difference between you and I. But things are starting to crop up that increasingly make me feel old. And I was walking through a mall and I saw this T-shirt and had that sort of realization that this year, this August, will be 20 years since the Astronomical Association stripped Pluto of its rightful God-given title. and that made me feel really old.
Oh, how about that?
So in a bit of solidarity, I thought I would wear this T-shirt, and also just because it's a nerdy thing, and we wear nerdy T-shirts here.
We do it well. Okay, time for me to plead guilty to that.
Yes.
Here we go. I am wearing David Peterson today, and let me just stand up, and you can take a look. That is actually his portrait at Queen's Park. That is what's on the front of my T-shirt today. And why am I wearing a T-shirt with Ontario's 20th Premier on it? Well, I'm going to tell you. Because there's a lot of talk these days about the Ontario Liberals who are in the midst of yet another leadership convention. And I will tell you that 44 years ago tomorrow, February 21st, 1982, David Peterson won the Ontario Liberal leadership. There is a lot of discussion this time round as well about how old you have to be to run for the leadership, because there's some people in their 30s who are running for it. And I'm hearing a lot of discussion from older Liberals who are saying, yeah, well, sure, the 30-somethings can take a run at it, but nobody takes them seriously. David Peterson won the leadership of the Ontario Liberals when he was 38.
Right.
And it wasn't his first go-round. He'd actually run the first time, the previous leadership convention, and he was 32 the first time. So take that. It was a delegated convention. I want to remind everybody of that, which are the best kind, of course. He was the clear favorite.
The only kind you will ever acknowledge.
I agree. He got 46% on the first ballot, so it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that he was going to win this thing. He came in very strong. Do you remember who he beat?
I don't offhand.
He defeated Sheila Copps, who was an MPP from Hamilton at the time and who would eventually abandon Peterson, go run federally, and eventually became the deputy prime minister for Jean Chrétien. But she came second in that convention. And just to show you how strange politics can be, when they did some polling in January of 1985, and they asked Ontarians, can you identify the leader of then Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, which was him?
Yes.
10% of the people could identify him. 10. Meant 90% of the people had no clue who David Peterson was.
And of the 10% who could identify him, 90% of those worked in Queen's Park in some capacity.
Or were related to him. 6 months after that poll was taken, he was the 20th Premier of Ontario. It just shows you how quickly things can turn around. He's the guy who ended the 42-year-long PC dynasty, which ended in 1985. Incidentally, I can scarcely believe it as I say this. He is now 82 years old. He is the chair of the board of Torstar, which of course publishes the Toronto Star, and he is still a very influential force in politics and in the country. So there we go, David Peterson, and that's his portrait at Queen's Park.
I don't know if I'm allowed to plug another podcast here, but
Why not?
There's a podcast from, I would say, the center left or progressive view of Think Progress Canada. They did a lengthy interview with David Peterson specifically on the topic of rebuilding a party in the wilds, if I could put it that way, and obviously relevant to the current predicament the Ontario Liberal Party finds itself in.
No question. And I remember one of the funniest things about this was he was born in 1943, which is the year the Tory dynasty started, meaning until he became the Liberal Premier of Ontario, there were exactly 0 Liberal Premiers of Ontario in his lifetime.
Yeah.
Just goes to show you, things can change. They can. And with that, let's get off to issue 1. It was one of the most iconic images of Doug Ford's current third term as Premier, excoriating the British liquor manufacturer Diageo in front of all the cameras. Ford emptied a bottle of Crown Royal all over the pavement to indicate his opposition to Diageo's closing one of its plants in Amherstburg, which is near Windsor. But it seems the Premier and the manufacturer have found a $23 million peace offering. JMM, what's up?
Peace in our time, right? The government says that Diageo has agreed to make $23 million in investments in Ontario to offset the jobs lost from the closure at the Amherstburg plant. Now, to be clear, that closure is still going ahead. Those union jobs are, for now, still being lost. The plant may reopen under new ownership, but that is still up in the air. The government is touting this as a win, saying that these investments wouldn't have happened without the pressure campaign that the Premier put on Diageo. And for its part, Ontario says that because of this settlement, Diageo brands will stay on the shelves at the LCBO. That, of course, was the threat that the Premier had made, that he would pull all of their liquor from LCBO shelves.
So $23 million. Where are they spending it, and on what?
I don't want to scandalize you, Steve, but sometimes governments say things that are not strictly accurate.
Wait a minute, say that again?
So we're going to go through this in a bit of detail, but I just want to sort of say that the headline here, at least to me, is that a very large fraction of what is being touted here is not really an investment by Diageo. But let's give the government its due first. There's $1 million in this package that is being spent on economic development and other community projects in Amherstburg itself by the usual standards of government spin. I think we can fairly call that at least an investment.
$1 million.
$1 million of the $23 million, I would say, is uncontroversially an investment. Then there's $3 million in a new ready-to-drink alcoholic beverage package that will be supplied via a Toronto partner company, and another $2 million for a packaging partner in Scarborough.
So what do we have to? We're $5 right now, being invested outside of southwestern Ontario for every $1 invested in southwestern Ontario.
Yes, so 5-1 so far. The benefits are going to Toronto as opposed to Amherstburg,
Which will make them thrilled, no doubt.
Indeed, right. Toronto, real tumbleweed-strewn city that needs all the help it can get. And things get squishier still. There is a promised $1 million for organizations that support the growth and sustainability of Ontario's agricultural sector, and a commitment to spend $5 million on marketing and promotion here in Ontario.
Okay, that gets us about halfway there. Where's the rest of the money?
So this is the thing. Fully $11 million of these so-called investments in Ontario, $11 million is a single large purchase by Diageo of alcohol for blending in their products, right? This is what I imagine is a pretty substantial purchase, but it's a volume purchase from Greenfield Global, which is a distillery in Eastern Ontario. And I say distillery, but this is like what I think most people would see as an industrial ethanol plant. This is not a mom and pop batch distillery. This is a large industrial plant. Now, this is a big purchase. I'm sure that Greenfield Global is happy to take Diageo's money, but it is at the end of the day just the bulk purchase of a commodity. This is not what you or I would normally describe as an investment, even by the standards of government spin. And to go back to what we were talking about earlier, for those keeping track at home, the overwhelming beneficiaries of this entire package, again, these are all the numbers that the government laid out in its own press release. The overwhelming beneficiaries of this package are Toronto and this Eastern Ontario distillery. About 4% of the money is going to Amherstburg and jobs and community projects around the plant where these jobs are being lost.
I suspect I don't even need to ask this question, but I will anyway. How's that going over in Amherstburg?
Yeah, funny you should ask. Amherstburg Mayor Michael Prue panned the deal, telling the CBC that none of this is going to help a single soul in Amherstburg. A note for our audience, you may not recognize the name Michael Prue, but he was a New Democrat MPP at the legislature. He previously represented Beaches, East York. He was actually my MPP when I became a Queen's Park reporter.
He was the last mayor of East York, too, I think.
I believe that's correct, yes.
Before the megacity came along.
He has had this I don't know what you would even call it, a third or fourth act in politics. He is now the mayor of Amherstburg. Also the local representative for Unifor, for these workers who were at the Diageo plant, was also disappointed, telling the CBC it's a pretty weak deal when Diageo makes so much money in the province every year.
I'm trying to remember now. I remember there were other premiers in Canada who were saying to Doug Ford, this is really not fair that you are doing this, making a big display of pouring the booze out all over the, and throwing it out, because as if that were a metaphor for what this company is doing to the province of Ontario, because we're supposed to be now in a new era in Canada where we're supposed to be less concerned about which province in particular has the manufacturing capability. The bigger deal is provincial boundaries down, keep the manufacturing somewhere in Canada, and Diageo does have a plant in Manitoba, and it does have a plant where else? Newfoundland, I think? Newfoundland and Labrador, somewhere down in Atlantic Canada anyway. And yet Doug Ford was making a big display of this, and he was saying, oh, no, don't get suckered into believing that this is going to stay in Canada. Before you know it, they're going to move everything to Alabama. Now, I like to kind of test the veracity of politicians' statements when they make them. Do we have any idea whether that is potentially true?
We have no evidence yet. Let me put it that way. One thing we are seeing an increasing trend, and I who knows how long it will last, given how intertwined it is with American politics right now. But a lot of manufacturers are going along two tracks, if I can put it that way. Right? They are of course locating production in the United States to maintain access to that market with a U.S. administration that is very fond of tariffs. But they are also rationalizing their production, and that's what Diageo says it's doing in this case. They are also consolidating their production, rationalizing it outside of the U.S. market as well. So they're sort of islanding their plants in the U.S. While also maintaining production outside the U.S. in the rest of the free world, if I can put it that way.
They got plants all over the world.
Yeah, and who knows how far this will go. There's been some interesting reporting just in the last week about Mark Carney trying to build a sort of a bridge between the European Union and some of the market economies of the what we used to call the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but a lot of Asian countries. And in theory, you could see a trading bloc of something like 1.5–2 billion people, and whether that materializes is obviously a very open question. But I do think you're seeing a lot of companies sort of hedge their bets and put production both in the U.S. and also outside of the U.S. So to get back to your question, I don't think it's obvious that the Canadian plants that Diageo says it's maintaining, I don't think that there's a ticking time bomb awaiting them. I think a company like Diageo would see those as assets to use outside of the U.S. to serve markets outside of the U.S.
We're not hedging here either. We're right off to issue 2. When the Progressive Conservatives took power nearly 8 years ago, one of the first things they did was freeze college and university tuition rates, thereby starving the post-secondary system of the money it needed to keep the lights on. The result? Courses were canceled, staff laid off, and students disappointed. Yes, their tuition was not going up, but their courses and the course choices that they had available were significantly reduced. Nearly 8 years later, the government seems to be changing course. What are they doing, JMM?
So the government is allowing tuitions to increase again. They are ending the freeze, and we'll get to that in a moment. But they are also making more provincial money available to universities. They are increasing the funding for universities and colleges from $5.4 billion to $7 billion annually. So over the course of 4 years, that will amount to $6.4 billion in new money. So the more controversial side of this, of course, is that they are in fact ending the tuition freeze. They are going to allow universities to increase tuition by 2% over the next 3 years, and then after that, it will be either 2% or the rate of inflation, whatever is lower.
That's not the most controversial part.
Well, indeed. The most controversial change is, I think, almost certainly their changes to OSAP, the student loan and grant assistance that I actually don't even know, but I assume the vast majority of Ontario students access it in one form or another. Currently, the students who access OSAP are able to receive up to 85% of their assistance in the form of grants, right, that do not need to be repaid. That threshold is being lowered to 25%. The maximum you will be able to get from OSAP as a grant will be 25%. The remainder would be made as a loan that would have to be repaid. So obviously, the financial assistance they receive will be more difficult for them to repay than it previously had been. Obviously, they see that as kind of a raw deal.
A little historical perspective here. 50 years ago, Ontario was funding per pupil in the post-secondary system 10th out of all 10 provinces. 50 years later, would you care to guess how well Ontario is funding on a per capita basis the post-secondary students of this province?
Are we still 10th out of 10?
We are still 10th. And I think maybe we jumped up to 9th for what do they call it, for a New York minute? Right. But that was about it. We've basically been 10th out of 10 for the last 50 years. Students naturally have been very upset about that. Here is some new money going into the system, which I suspect everybody will appreciate. The Premier had some things to say to students who are very unhappy with the changes to OSAP that are coming down. So let's see what he had to say. Doug Ford.
You're picking basket weaving courses, and there's not too many baskets being sold out there. Go into healthcare, go into trades, go into jobs of the future.
Did you take basket weaving in post-secondary? I didn't take basket weaving.
No, basket weaving was not available to me in either my bachelor's or master's degree.
Anyway, what's, sometimes the Premier can't help himself. What's the reaction been this time?
I have to say, there is a technocratic argument that the government is making smart moves here, and a quote like the one offered by the Premier does not help sell it, if I could put it that way. Ending the tuition freeze, I think most observers said like it had to come to an end one way or the other, and it probably would have been better if the government had ended it earlier, in fact. The changes to OSAP are more arguable. They will probably disproportionately make it harder for low-income students to access post-secondary education. That's a genuine problem, and hopefully the government can make policy to lessen that burden. Obviously, students are not going to be happy about this, but educating students is only one part of what the university and college system does, right? We also hope to fund, world-class research institutes, and it's a much more important pillar of the economy in that sense than simply educating students, as much as it's also kind of like educating students is what keeps the lights on for a lot of these places. As I say, there are arguable benefits to a lot of these changes, but that line from the Premier about basket weaving maybe not helpful.
We have talked on this show, I think on more than a few occasions, about a blue ribbon panel, so-called, that the Premier's own government struck. It's got to be a couple of years ago already that happened. And this was, again, the Premier's own appointees to its own blue ribbon panel. They came back with a recommendation a couple of years ago saying, you got to up the amount of money going into the post-secondary system because we're on the verge of having, a significantly deteriorated system. And okay, I'm going to do it here. Bill Davis used to say, get education right and everything else falls into place. Yeah. A better educated population means a healthier population, better jobs, more income, all of the things we want, we get when people are better educated. The things we don't want, we don't, if people get less education, that's what you get. So let's go back to that blue ribbon panel. How does this get closer to what that panel ultimately recommended?
As I mentioned, the end of the tuition freeze is something that the panel recommended and that universities and colleges desperately wanted to see. But the increase in funding available from that tuition increase on a per student level, it's I mean, for some people, of course, every marginal dollar is a burden, and I don't want to minimize that. But the relative change, certainly in the first few years, is not going to be huge. But as we say, Ontario is still, even with these changes, Ontario is still on track to be 10th out of 10 rather, in terms of provincial per capita spending. CUPE, the union that represents most workers in universities and colleges, noted, of course, that Ontario's funding is still well short. Adjusted for once you adjust for inflation and the change in student population, they estimate that the system will still be about $1.5 billion short of where it was in 2018. That's just the cumulative effect of tuition and other funding not keeping up with demand. They are saying that even with this new money, there will still be cuts to jobs. And of course, we've seen both layoffs and both a threat of and, in fact, the start of some strikes through the system. CUPE says we can expect more of that unless more money is made available. Not quite a peace settlement here yet.
Not quite, no. And we should not forget the other piece of this, which is the federal government had a role in a lot of the starvation, if you want to use that word, of the postsecondary system, because when they cut back on the number of student visas from foreign students, that was money. And remember, these foreign students were paying 3, 4, 5 times the tuition rates that made in Ontario kids were paying. And as a result, the loss of that money really hurt as well. It was a perfect storm.
It's dynamic in the sense of like the province froze tuitions, so universities and colleges, because of course they froze domestic tuitions. Universities and colleges went and recruited foreign students to make up that gap. The federal government threw the doors open and said, hey, great, we want more people. We want more students coming to Canada and studying here. That created this huge surge. But then provinces didn't, for example, address like housing issues. The immigration wave became incredibly unpopular. The federal government then pulled back on student visas. And then the universities and colleges, who, let's go back to the beginning, were trying to fill the hole created in part by the tuition freeze, suddenly found themselves looking at bare shelves, like empty wallets, if I could put it that way. More than enough blame to go around for everybody.
What was Newton's third law? Every action has an equal and opposite reaction?
Yes, true in politics.
True in politics as well. Yes. Let's move on to issue 3. Well, we've got some more evidence this week that school boards are deeply concerned that they're about to be legislated out of existence by this provincial government. Meredith Radlin is the chair of the Waterloo Region District School Board, and she has written the Education Minister formally requesting his ministry undertake a comprehensive, province-wide consultation or even a referendum before making any irreversible decision about the future of school boards. Radlin has also written the Ontario Ombudsman, asking him to intervene and review what's going on. This is, I suspect, the clearest case yet that school boards think their ultimate demise is coming.
Yeah, so this builds on a number of signs we've seen from the government. The most obvious being that I believe now 7 school boards are under provincial supervision with a director appointed by the Minister of Education, functionally taking over the roles of the school board trustees. Many rumors that the province will simply, as you say, legislate the school boards out of existence. And the minister, when he's spoken about this publicly, has always caveated it by saying that he is going to leave the Catholic boards alone and leave the French language school boards alone because they have constitutional protections. The Catholic board, since Canada's inception in 1867, the French language boards have protections under the Charter from 1981. So now we have this letter from Radlin specifically asking the government to preserve English language public boards and asking for public consultation and asking for the ombudsman to investigate.
Well, the ombudsman has influence, but I don't know if the ombudsman has power. Can the ombudsman demand anything here?
No. Even the ombudsman could write an extremely critical report about this, but the ombudsman does not have any direct power to alter the course of government policy. That is not the role that we generally give officers of the legislature. Insofar as there is a role for the ombudsman here, I think it would be looking at whether students and parents in the education system are being treated fairly by administrators. And, we've already heard from some advocates that there's a real concern they have that if they no longer have elected trustees on their side, that they could get into disputes with school administration about, let's say, for example, matters of, student discipline or whether students have proper access to extended services that they might need. Without an elected trustee on their side, they're worried about just getting swallowed up in the bureaucracy of the education system. And that's exactly the kind of issue that an ombudsman would be well suited to address and perhaps write a report about. But no, they can't stop legislation.
Well, I know when we have municipal elections that the number of people who vote for trustees is kind of embarrassingly low.
Yeah.
Having said that, if you have a problem either with your school or with the system or with a director of education or whatever, I mean, at the moment, the person you call is your trustee, and your trustee is supposed to be your advocate to try to make things make sense in the public education system right now. If they get rid of trustees, I mean, who do you call if not Ghostbusters? I don't know.
Well, I mean, and that is one potential political problem for the government, right? Mm-hmm. If you legislate away school board trustees, then the Minister of Education becomes the person who you call, right? This all becomes the government's fault and the government's problem, right?
You break it, you own it.
Yeah, exactly. Like at the moment, I don't think many people are like calling up Paul Calandra and screaming at him because the school bus didn't pick up their kid.
Well, first of all, you can't get to him.
Well,
that'd be number
that.
one. But number two, yeah, you're right. They don't call the Minister of Education. They call the trustee.
Yeah. We can make the argument that it would be, I think, wise for the government to engage in broad consultation if they're going to make a very big change like this. But there is also a time limit here in that we are holding a municipal and school board trustee election in October. Mm-hmm. So I frankly don't expect them to consult very lengthly.
You don't see province-wide public hearings in the near future?
No. And, it's not a requirement, right? Just as I could put it as a procedural or a constitutional, matter, right? This is squarely in provincial jurisdiction. The legislature can make law regarding matters of provincial jurisdiction so long as the bill is properly introduced and gets 3 readings and 3 votes at the legislature and is signed by the lieutenant governor. That is a good bill. That is a good law, and courts have tended to defer to it. Now, I say that, but the Canadian Civil Liberties Association did speak at Queen's Park this week, and one of the things that they mentioned is that of the school boards that have been placed under supervision by the province at the moment, many of them are the most diverse school boards in Ontario, and they serve some of the highest populations of low-income people in Ontario. And so I definitely don't want to get out on a limb here, but one of the only potential avenues I could see for successfully challenging this in court would be to argue that dissolving the English language school boards, but not Catholic or French language school boards, is a form of unequal treatment of certain demographics in Ontario that is not permissible under the Charter.
It's an argument.
It's an argument. I have no idea how the courts would handle that argument, but it is something that I would flag for our audience as something to keep in mind, because I do suspect that if the government brings forward legislation, it will in fact get challenged, because almost every major policy this government presents does get fought in court.
And I think we should be clear here. You and I are not taking a position on whether they should or should not abolish school board trustees. No. I think what we are saying is, the position of school board trustee is the oldest elected position in Canadian history. Yeah. They predate Confederation. And if you're going to get rid of something that has existed for literally more than 158 years, you better have thought it through. Yes. So I think that's all we're saying.
Yeah, and you used the words irreversible changes in the setup to this, and it's funny because other provinces have abolished school boards only for an election to ensue, a different government to be brought into power, and then have school boards reestablished in some cases. So
that's rare. Usually,
it is rare.
Usually, when the toothpaste's out of the tube, it stays out.
Yeah, and I would not expect necessarily like a future government, if we get down this road where this government abolishes school boards, I don't necessarily expect a future government to restore them. But all I will say is it's rare to find a truly irreversible change, right? A government that was motivated could, in fact, bring school boards back if they wanted to.
That's true. Although I noticed the megacity still exists.
Yes.
I noticed that closed hospitals from 30 years ago did not reopen. I noticed that welfare rates that were cut 30 years ago have not been reestablished. I've noticed that. Anyway, I won't go on.
Well, and we'll get to the next segment. I won't belabor this, but, if the next government does not restore school boards, that will also tell us something about how valuable and useful any government sees them as in the administration of education.
And with that, let's get off to your column, my column. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I have a little chat about the columns that we wrote for the TVO website over the past week. We love it when you hear about the columns here, and then you go online to tvo.org and you click on our pictures and you find the columns and you read them and say, oh, I feel so much better informed about all of these issues now. So what are you going to better inform us about right now?
Well, I got on my soapbox a little bit this week where you wrote something a week or two ago about a group of people who are trying to ban the advertisements for sports gambling during sports broadcasts. And I not only do I support that, I honestly think we need to go even further. So like, just to set the table here, I mean, not only do we have plenty of evidence that the explosion in online sports gambling is corrosive to sports, we know that it is disproportionately creating financial harms for people with lower incomes. It is particularly harming young men on low incomes. And there's just almost nothing to recommend it as a policy decision at this point. We are not even, frankly, making a ton of money, at least on the public side of things, from having legalized and regulated sports gambling. The most recent figure from the province of Ontario is that for the current fiscal year, we are expected to make something like, the province is expected to collect something like 250 million, 230 million, I forget exactly, which is objectively a large sum, but it's also about what Ontario spends before noon on any given day, right? It's just not that much money in the scale of the provincial budget. And so with all of the evidences of the harms that online gambling has created, and frankly, the spread of what I would call sort of gambling adjacent like things. And I'm talking here about things like prediction markets, where we have seen, probably like the one that sticks in my brain as like maybe one of the most alarming cases was think tanks that have been maintaining maps of the war front in Ukraine. There was an allegation that some of the information being provided, and like this is an incredibly useful public resource, and there was an allegation that some of that information was changed in order to capitalize on online betting in these prediction markets. I mean, stuff like that is just skeeving me right out. And so obviously some of this stuff is just not within Canadian jurisdiction and is not something that we can change. But insofar as there is stuff within Canadian and Ontario jurisdiction that we can regulate, I really have come down pretty securely on the side of not only do we need to prohibit advertising of online gambling, I really think we need to consider the last decade something of a bit of a mistake. And we were never really meant to have casinos in our pockets, and that is what we have now. We have,
they're on our phones
through online gambling. We have slot machines in our pockets, and I don't believe that is healthy for individuals, and I don't believe it is healthy for us as a public. And people say, oh well, if you try to prohibit it, people will just go back to using offshore websites and stuff. And I just don't think that's true, right? Like the actual history, when it was more difficult to gamble online, fewer people gambled online. The whole explosion of access has become a problem precisely because it is so easy. And if we make it more difficult for people to gamble online, I really do think we will just see fewer people gambling online, and that will be better for, as I say, better for individuals and better for the public.
Fascinating. Good.
How about you?
Well, a little background before we start here. For 50 years, there was a former Ontario cabinet minister named Darcy McHugh. He was the treasurer back in the Bill Davis days. He used to host a lunch in downtown Toronto in honor of the first premier he ever served, which was Mr. Davis's predecessor, John Robarts. Mr. Robarts was the premier from 1961 to 71. You all, of course, know about the big library at the University of Toronto that's named after John Robarts. It was a very particular kind of lunch. It was men only. It was pretty much Tory men only. It was lots of pipe and cigar smoking,
Right.
and a lot of booze, but also a lot of good stories. And I know about this because I used to get invited to go to this lunch because I wrote a book about Mr. Robarts, but I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. So I attended, and even though I was probably 15, 20 years younger than everybody else, I kind of liked the stories, and I thought it was, there was a lot of history that I learned listening to all these stories and so on. Darcy McHugh died in 2023, and I thought, I wonder if we can somehow keep this lunch going, albeit with some changes to modernize it. So I spoke to both of Darcy McHugh's sons, Stuart and Jamie, and I said, would you mind if I try to keep this going? And they said, no problem at all. And I said, great, I want to honor your father as well, so we're going to call it now the Robarts McHugh Lunch. And it's going to be an annual thing, and it's going to be obviously men and women, and it's going to be all parties represented, and it's going to be, okay, a little booze, but no smoking. And sorry, Darcy, but that's what we got to do now. We had our third annual Robarts McHugh lunch last week. Greg Lyle from the Innovative Research Group, one of the country's better pollsters, came and he shared some fresh data with us on whether the public cares about something that you and I care a lot about and talk about from time to time here, namely civility in politics. And do we care about it, particularly in this age of political toxicity? And I am delighted to report that apparently, yes, we do, across all party stripes and supporters in all age demographics. Now, read the column if you want more specifics. There's all sorts of charts in there that'll tell you, break it all down for you. But as an example of something we just saw, the picture in British Columbia of the Prime Minister of Canada and the leader of the opposition, who are after each other hammer and tong almost every day, standing there at this vigil after the mass murder in British Columbia, holding hands, united in their grief, trying to project an image of unity for the country. That means a lot to a lot of people, and the polling proves that. So go to the website, check a look at this column. We need civility in politics. We need, of course, a clash of partisan ideas as well. I'm not saying we don't, but less toxicity, more civility would be a good thing. I'll share, if I may, one more story about this Robarts McHugh lunch, and that is, you're a Star Trek Next Generation fan?
I am indeed.
Okay. We happen to be meeting on the actual date of the 55th anniversary of the Leadership Convention in 1971 at Maple Leaf Gardens that picked Bill Davis as the leader of the Ontario PC Party on the fourth ballot at 2 a.m. by 44 votes in a good old-fashioned delegated convention. John Robarts was the premier at the time. Mr. Davis was elected to replace him, and he won that convention on the strength of Darcy McHugh dropping off the penultimate ballot and getting some of his delegates to support Mr. Davis. He was the kingmaker. Sheldon, can I have this picture up here, please? Because here we have a picture of Neil Davis, the son of Bill Davis, in the middle, Stuart McHugh, the son of Darcy McHugh, on the left, and Richard Robarts, who is a cousin of John Robarts's, on the right. 55 years to the day that the older generation made history at Maple Leaf Gardens, the younger generation, the next generation, met at this Robarts McHugh lunch. And interestingly enough, these three had never met before.
Oh, wonderful.
So this was kind of, I thought so too. I thought it was kind of a lovely, wonderful moment. So there we go. This is the kind of political nerdery you too can experience if you come to the lunch next year, and I hope you will.
All right, with that, let's go to the mailbag.
You got it. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, please send it along to us at onpolitics@tvo.org. What do we got up this week?
This is an email from listener Kathleen from Whitby, who writes, I'm looking at a full-page ad for Intersect 2026. This is a conference put on by the Globe and Mail. Doug Ford is going to be a speaker at this future-based dialogue, and tickets are $1,000. Is this ethical? He's speaking about key issues impacting Ontario and our nation. It seems like he's already getting paid to do that. I'm just curious about the ethics of this and if other premiers have done similar things. It seems like something you should do after you're done being the premier. I love your podcast. Thank you for doing it, and I will be listening. Thanks, Kathleen. For those who don't know, as I mentioned earlier, Intersect is hosted by the Globe and Mail newspaper. Doug Ford is both speaking there and being interviewed by our Queen's Park colleague, Laura Stone.
And I'm willing to bet that of the $1,000 that people have to pay to go to this, none of that's going to end up in Doug Ford's pocket.
So I did reach out to the Premier's office to confirm the Premier is not accepting any kind of speaking fee. They also emphasized he has never accepted any kind of speaking fee for these kinds of public engagements. But for the sake of some remedial civics, let's say that wasn't true and that Premier Ford accepted a speaking fee for this engagement. This falls under the Members' Integrity Act, and generally speaking, MPPs are forbidden from accepting gifts or fees that are connected either directly or indirectly with their duties as MPPs. The principle being, as Kathleen says, you get paid to be an MPP, and you should not be taking money from outside of that to do your job. Now, there are exceptions to the rule. First, if it's incidental or a customary gift that is normally connected to what the Act calls social obligations accompanying the office. So if the Premier goes to a catered event to represent Ontario's interests in Washington, D.C., for example, he's not breaking the law if he eats a canapé, or, another example.
Or even takes a gift.
Yeah. And so,
of a certain value.
Periodically, when a Toronto-based sports team is doing well, right, there's always like some bet between, the Premier of Ontario or a Premier of another province or a state governor that, somebody has to wear the other's shirt if Toronto wins or loses.
Jersey.
Sorry, Jersey, yes. This is what I get. And so, if Doug Ford were to accept the gift of a jersey from the governor of California or whatever, that would not violate the law, right? So the other exception, political parties are allowed to provide gifts and other benefits to their members. So, for example, the Liberal Party could provide money to top up an MPP's salary if that person was their leader. They could do that without breaking the law. And third, this is sort of a bit of a catch-all term, the Integrity Commissioner can determine that a gift is okay if it won't give rise to the perception of a conflict of interest. This is important, though, because the Integrity Commissioner does not actually enforce the Members' Integrity Act in the usual sense of the word, right? If an MPP believes that the law has been broken, they ask the Integrity Commissioner to conduct an investigation. The Commissioner then reports back to the legislature whether the law has been broken, and it's up to the legislature to determine whether the MPP will be punished or not. So just to bring it back to Kathleen's email, first of all, the Premier does not seem to have broken any rules here. Even if he were, it would be up to the legislature to determine his ultimate punishment. And I don't need to remind everybody listening to this podcast that Doug Ford currently leads the party that holds a very substantial majority in the legislature. So I do not expect he would be punished even if an Integrity Commissioner report came out saying that he had broken the law.
Kathleen's question is a good one because once upon a time, and it wasn't that long ago, I think it was before 2015, and I'll tell you how I remember it's before 2015, this was a thing in the nation's capital because there was a backbencher in the Liberal caucus, which was the third place party in Parliament at the time, a backbencher by the name of Justin Trudeau, who was so famous that he was being asked to speak at a lot of events for which speaking fees were paid. And when that emerged, it did create a bit of a firestorm because people were saying exactly what Kathleen was saying, namely, wait a second, you're paid, this is presumably part of your job as a paid member of Parliament to do this. And after that sort of got out, Mr. Trudeau had to stop taking speaking fees, and then he won an election, became prime minister, and he didn't need to worry about it anymore after that anyway.
And I think the history of integrity rules and ethics rules, both federally and at Queen's Park, is fascinating. The decisions and the behaviors that used to be allowable under provincial law today read as kind of hilariously corrupt. And so, as you can probably guess from my summary, like the Members' Integrity Act has some weaknesses in terms of actually controlling the behaviors of MPPs, but it is certainly better than what has existed, again, in the 1960s and 70s, where some of these stories come from.
There we go. Give the email address, sir, and let's get out of here.
Yes, absolutely. Again, if you'd like to ask about any content on our show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the OnPoli podcast for this Friday, February 20th, 2026.
You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced by Matthew Amara, editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Okay, the next thing I'm going to say is to give props to our wonderful studio crew for getting everything organized here so we can do this. And I want to give one person a shout out, and I want to give one person a shame. The shout out goes to, I don't know, where's Tony Burke right now? Tony, is he in the control room? I'm giving a shout out to Tony Burke, because he's a big Montreal Canadiens fan, and I suspect there was nobody around TVO who was happier to see Nick Suzuki tip that puck into the net, which saved our day against the Czech Republic a couple days ago, which meant that Mitch Marner could be the hero in overtime. So that's my shout out. And my shame is this guy who didn't even watch the game. How could you not watch the game? That's pathetic.
I was writing. I was doing my duty to the people of Ontario.
I don't
and working.
care. You have a bigger duty as a Canadian to be watching our men and women in the gold medal. Well, it's not gold medal yet, but in their quest for gold.
It was one of those things where I was, as I'm wont to do, even when I'm writing, I was keeping an eye on social media in case anything blew up that I missed. And it was one of those things, everybody's talking about their own things on Twitter and Blue Sky and all these other places. Everybody has their own topics. And then suddenly everybody was only talking about one thing, and it was this game. And I was like, I should be paying some attention.
Yes.
But,
yes, you should.
I was on deadline and I had to write. So no, I was not able to watch the game.
John Michael, if Hansard were here, it would say some honorable members, shame, shame, shame. Anyway, you still have a chance to redeem yourself because there are, God willing, 2 more games still to come.
Yes.
We shall see. Anyway, that's it for us. Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.